the people of Crow Hollow called him the child who kept rotting. It was not a name born of cruelty, but the only description that fit what they saw with their own eyes in the autumn of 1952, when a boy emerged from the West Virginia mountain fog, his flesh appearing to decay even as he drew breath. In the deep heart of Appalachia, where the Allegheny Mountains fold into themselves like secrets kept too long, there existed places forgotten by time itself. One such place was Crow Hollow, a settlement so isolated its residents had not seen a stranger in nearly 4 decades. America in 1952 was celebrating its post-war boom, building highways and suburbs, gazing toward a gleaming future. But in Crow Hollow, the Harlow family lived as their ancestors had for 7 generations, in a pocket of darkness where progress feared to tread. Their compound sat at the end of an 18-mile dirt road that wound through dense pine forest before disappearing into wilderness. There were no mailboxes, no telephone lines, no electricity. The family survived on what they could hunt, grow, and preserve. They had their own cemetery, their own church, their own laws. Most importantly, they had their own bloodline, unbroken and undiluted since their patriarch, Ezekiel Harlow, first claimed this land in 1789. What the outside world did not know, what it could not have imagined, was that the Harlows had not married outside their family in over 160 years. The discovery began, as so many terrible revelations do, with simple curiosity. In October 1952, a young surveyor named Thomas Whitfield, mapping terrain for a proposed coal mine, became hopelessly lost. For 3 days he wandered through forests so thick sunlight barely touched the ground. On the 4th day, starving and delirious, he stumbled into a clearing and saw what would haunt him until his death in 1987. A boy of perhaps 8 or 9 sat perfectly still on a rotting stump. At first, Thomas thought it was a statue, some strange folk art. Then the boy turned his head, and Thomas Whitfield screamed. The child's face was a map of suffering written in flesh. His left eye socket was empty, sealed by scarred tissue that pulled his features into a permanent grimace. His jaw was malformed, jutting forward so his mouth hung perpetually open, revealing teeth growing in chaotic directions, some horizontal, some pointing inward. His skin had a grayish pallor, peeling away in places as if his body was rejecting itself. The fingers on his right hand were fused into a flipper-like appendage. His left hand had 7 fingers, 2 bending backward at the knuckle. But it was the smell Thomas would never forget, the odor of decay, of flesh breaking down, of something dying that had never truly been alive. The boy did not speak. He simply stared with his one functioning eye, which held an intelligence and a sorrow far beyond his years. Then he raised his malformed hand and pointed deeper into the forest, toward a column of smoke. Thomas Whitfield should have run. Every instinct screamed at him to flee. But something in the boy's gaze held him, a silent plea, a desperate need to be seen. He followed the boy for nearly an hour, until the trees formed a natural tunnel blocking the pale autumn sun. The air grew colder, damper, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something organic and unsettling. When they emerged, Thomas Whitfield stood at the edge of a nightmare. Some 30 structures stood in various states of decay, cabins and sheds with walls green from moss and fungus. Chickens with missing feathers and strange growths wandered about. Dogs with too many or too few legs lay in the dirt. And then the people emerged. A woman with no nose, just 2 holes in her face. A man whose spine curved so severely his head nearly touched his knees. Twin girls with fingers fused together, their hands grown into one. An elderly man with a head twice the normal size, fluid pressing against his thin skull. Watching over them all, standing on the porch of the largest cabin, was the patriarch, Malachi Harlow, 63 years old, great-great-great-grandson of Ezekiel. He was the most normal-looking resident, which made him more terrifying. Tall and gaunt, with a long gray beard and eyes the color of dirty ice, he wore a black suit patched into threadbare fragility. When he smiled at Thomas, he revealed a mouthful of perfect teeth, the only perfect thing in the entire compound. "Welcome, stranger," Malachi said, his voice carrying a strange musicality from another century. "It has been 41 years since our last visitor. A government man for the census. He stayed for supper. He stayed forever, in fact. Thomas understood immediately he would not leave Crow Hollow alive unless he played his cards very carefully. What he witnessed over the next 72 hours would become the basis for one of West Virginia's most disturbing investigations, an investigation that would be suppressed, sealed, and forgotten for decades. He saw a family tree that did not branch but circled back on itself like a snake consuming its own tail. Brothers with sisters, fathers with daughters, mothers with sons. The Harlows believed they were blessed, chosen by God to remain pure. Ezekiel had preached that mixing with outsiders would dilute their divine essence, and his descendants had taken this to its most horrifying extreme. The boy who led Thomas there was named Isaiah, 8 years old, the offspring of half-siblings who were also first cousins. His genetic code was so damaged his body was literally falling apart, his skin unable to regenerate, his organs developing incorrectly. Doctors would later coin a term for his condition, spontaneous tissue necrosis. His body was rotting from the inside out. But Isaiah was not an anomaly, he was the norm. Of the 37 people in the compound, 34 suffered significant genetic abnormalities. The infant mortality rate was estimated at 70%. Thomas escaped on his third night, running through the forest for 2 days until he emerged on a rural highway 60 miles away, so traumatized he could barely speak. The authorities did not believe him at first. But Thomas had proof, a photograph from a Kodak camera hidden in his equipment. It showed Isaiah standing before a hand-painted sign, the Harlow Family Chapel, pure in blood, pure in spirit, established 1847. That photograph launched a 3-year investigation involving 7 state agencies, ultimately forcing the dissolution of the Harlow compound. But the full truth would never be made public. The files were sealed in 1956, classified as sensitive material likely to cause public disturbance. Until now. This is the story of the Harlow family, a story of isolation, religious extremism, and the devastating consequences of a bloodline that collapsed inward upon itself. It is a story of children born into suffering, of lives lived in darkness, of a community beyond the reach of American law and conscience. It is the story of the child who kept rotting and the family whose stagnant blood created him. To understand their descent into genetic catastrophe, we must travel back to the late 18th century. Ezekiel Harlow, born in 1761, was a charismatic man convinced God had chosen him for a special purpose. In 1785, he had a divine revelation. God commanded him to establish a pure community, untainted by the outside world. In 1789, he led his family into the wilderness, finding a hollow so remote he declared, "Here we shall build our Zion. Here the Harlow blood shall remain pure until the end of days." From the beginning, Ezekiel discouraged outside contact. When his eldest son expressed interest in a woman from a distant settlement, Ezekiel beat him severely. The son later married his first cousin. The message was clear. The first generation saw minimal genetic damage. But by the second generation, with marriages arranged between the closest available relatives, the genetic diversity collapsed. By the third generation, church records showed that of 43 children born, only 19 survived to adulthood. The family reinterpreted deformities as marks of blessing, signs of divine favor. A child with an extra finger was touched by God's hand. This religious justification allowed them to continue without confronting the consequences. By the fourth generation, the family tree was so tangled individuals were their own cousins, uncles, and nephews. A geneticist later noted the family had achieved a level of genetic homozygosity that should have been impossible to sustain. Polydactyly, fused digits, cleft palates, heart defects, immune deficiencies, all became routine. But the most devastating effects were cognitive. By the 20th century, only 1 in 10 family members possessed normal cognitive function. Malachi Harlow assumed leadership in 1934. He was the product of a union between half-siblings, yet relatively genetically diverse. He had been sent to an outside school at 12, learning of a world that would view his family with horror. So he made a decision: rather than reform the family, he would protect them, strengthening their isolation. Under him, the compound became even more closed. They existed in a terrible equilibrium, a community too damaged to integrate, yet resilient enough to perpetuate itself. It was a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding for over a century and a half when Thomas Whitfield stumbled into it. The photograph Thomas brought out landed on the desk of State Police Captain Howard Jennings on November 15, 1952. Jennings organized an expedition. What they found confirmed every terrible detail. They documented 37 individuals, reconstructed a maze of a family tree, and found an average coefficient of inbreeding equivalent to the offspring of full siblings. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the expedition's physician, examined Isaiah. He wrote that the boy's cellular regeneration had essentially ceased. His body continues to function, but it cannot repair itself. I estimate his lifespan at no more than 2 to 3 years. The state faced a dilemma. The Harlows had committed no easily prosecutable crime, and they did not wish to be rescued. "You see us as broken," Malachi said. "But we see ourselves as pure." The state's compromise, offering voluntary medical care and monitoring, failed almost immediately. Isaiah Harlow died on March 17, 1954. He was 9 years old. He was buried under a wooden cross that read, "Pure in blood, pure in spirit." The compound might have continued indefinitely if not for journalist Margaret Chen. In 1955, she published an article titled, "The Hidden Hollow, America's Secret Shame." The national outcry led to an emergency measure authorizing the removal of all minor children. When officials returned on November 3, 1955, they found the compound nearly abandoned. Malachi had ordered the family to scatter. "We are like seeds scattered by the wind," he told them. "Wherever we land, we will take root. The Harlow blood will continue." He died 3 weeks later. The scattering created new tragedies across Appalachia. Family groups settled in isolated hollows, changing names but often continuing their practices in secret. In 1978, a social worker in eastern Kentucky found a family with familiar patterns of deformity. They called themselves the Whole Family, but their hidden Bible revealed they were Harlows. The total number affected has never been fully known. Estimates range from hundreds to over 1,000. It stands as one of the most extreme examples of genetic isolation in American history. The Crow Hollow compound now lies within a national forest, the cabins collapsed, the cemetery unmarked. But the legacy of stagnant blood continues in places. Most families who keep to themselves are harmless, but some carry the Harlow inheritance, a reminder that the sins of the fathers are visited upon the children. Isaiah Harlow died in 1954. A child who never had a chance. But his photograph became evidence of a tragedy allowed to unfold in America's hidden places. His story stands as a warning against the dangers of isolation, of extremism, of the belief that any bloodline can remain pure without consequence. The child who kept rotting is gone, his flesh finally at rest. But his memory endures, a ghost in the mountains, a reminder of what happens when blood becomes stagnant, when families turn inward, when suffering is sanctified and isolation becomes absolute. This is the legacy of Crow Hollow. This is the price of purity. This is the story of the Harlow family, told at last.